All right, everyone, welcome to our Bible study for November 9th. Today we're going to do what some people call one of the weirdest, most difficult passages in the whole Bible. And that is Judges 19. So again, I'll just do a little history for what we have talked about previously in our group. And we have looked at the sin. What was the sin of Sodom? That's sort of the question that we've been wrestling with. And we were testing two hypotheses. One is the sin of homosexuality. And we said, well, if we're going to say it's about homosexuality, about sexual ethics, there's certain assumptions that we need to make. And so I'll mention we need to look at these stories as the basis for our sexual ethics and for how we should act. And then our other hypothesis was failure to provide hospitality. And again, we sort of looked at a similar assumption that, well, we ought to look at these as the basis for our ethics on how to treat strangers. So let me read for you Judges 19, the Levite's concubine. And I'm reading from the NRSV, and it uses the word concubine. The actual word in the Hebrew, though, is it's not exactly certain what that word means. It's definitely not the word for like your first wife, but it could be a secondary wife, and so we don't know exactly the position that this woman had. It's interesting in that none of the characters in this story are named, and we can talk about that later. So here's Judges 19. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite, residing in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine became angry with him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for 4 months. Then her husband set out after her to speak tenderly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. When he reached her father's house, the girl's father saw him and came with joy to meet him. His father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with them 3 days. So they ate and drank, and he stayed there. On the 4th day, they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Fortify yourself with a bit of food, and after that you may go." So the two men sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Why not spend the night and enjoy yourself?" When the man got up to go, his father-in-law kept urging him until he spent the night there again. On the 5th day, he got up early in the morning to leave, and the girl's father said, "Fortify yourself." So they lingered until the day declined, and the two of them ate and drank. When the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, the father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Look, the day is worn on until it is almost evening. Spend the night. See, the day is drawn to a close. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. Tomorrow you can get up early in the morning for your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He got up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will continue on to Gibeah." Then he said to his servant, "Come, let us try to reach one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. He went in and sat down in the open square of the city, but no one took them in to spend the night. Then at evening, there was an old man coming from his work in the field. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was residing in Gibeah. The people of the place were Benjamites. When the old man looked up and saw the wayfarer in the open square of the city, he said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" He answered him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to my home. Nobody has offered to take me in. We, your servants, have straw and fodder for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and the woman and the young man along with us. We need nothing more." The man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and fed the donkeys. They washed their feet and ate and drank. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, ravish them, and do whatever you want to them. But against this man, do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and put her out to them. They wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As the morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "we're going." There was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. When he had entered his house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Then he commanded the men whom he sent, saying, "Thus shall you say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out." Alrighty. Very, very difficult, disturbing story. Let me do a quick poll. So if you just see on your screen, just asking one question: have you heard the story of the Levite's concubine? Okay, well, so thanks. Everybody has participated. So we had one yes and then 6 no's. So only one person's heard of this story. This sounds a lot like the story that we read last week in Sodom. It's like very much parallels with that story. What were some parallels that y'all saw with the Sodom story that we read last week, or that you are familiar with from the Sodom story?
Did they really mention the word intercourse this time, or was that in?
It is the euphemism so that we may know them. So it's that Hebrew euphemism for sex. It says send them out so that we may know them. It's what you'll probably would see in like the King James version, I would bet.
Okay, so that would be the same thing as we've read.
Right. It's the same euphemism. The Hebrew word is yada, which means to know. That's what the study Bible says. And it says, if there's any ambiguity about what this means, it disappears with the offer of the young women in verse 24. That's what the commentary in the study Bible here says. Obviously, we have a lot of similarities. The men in Gibeah are wanting to violate, basically they're just banging on the door, wanting to rape the man who's there, like they wanted to do with the angels. Somehow we have this bizarre custom where it's, we have such a disparity between men and women and how they're considered in the society that you can just throw your virgin daughter and this concubine out and let them have their way with them, but you're going to protect this man's kind of honor. So any other similarities or any other connections that you see? I mean, one thing for me I think is interesting that I'd never heard this story before I had my Old Testament class, and it's so parallel to Sodom. It's interesting that you don't hear this story, and I think probably the reason it's never taught in church, or you never hear a sermon for it. It is a really, really difficult story to kind of grapple with. And let me go back.
Well, it's talking about women this time, and how, looking at history, how women were inferior, quote unquote. So y'all don't kill me. But yeah, that's probably why this wasn't mentioned as much, is because it involved women and they weren't looked at as the same class, I guess you could say, the same level as men.
Yeah, so Phyllis Tribble is a feminist theologian, biblical scholar, I should say. So in 1984, she published this book called Texts of Terror. And so she looks at 4 different passages in the Bible and calls these texts of terror and talks about how they reflect, describe, and critique the violence humans inflict upon one another, as well as our ignorance, complicity, and culpability, and the brutality and victimization of women and others. That was a slide that I had meant to share. So this is something that's viewed as a text of terror. And so I think, it is something that is difficult for us to even contemplate. And, some people want to take the Bible and say, okay, well, it's really an instruction manual. You've heard this here. This is the instruction manual for modern living. I don't know what you do with this particular story in that context, other than to just critique the story and to do as Phyllis Tribble did and say, look, this is a horrific story, and we have to really sort of call this out as such. So let's talk about the first part of the story in the beginning of 19. So there was this period, the chapter starts, in those days when there was no king in Israel. And there's this sort of common theme as you look in Judges. So this is the period before Israel has a king, and Israel is basically governed by a series of judges. And it's like different areas have different judges, and there's not, kind of like an overall ruler. And so there was this notion that the people just sort of did what they wanted to, that the people just didn't, that the sort of Israel was out of control, and that these horrific stories were used sort of then to justify why Israel needed a king, which comes later on. Because this is Judges. The next book in the Bible is is Ruth, and which Ruth is really sort of out of place in our Protestant Bible. It's sort of a counterpoint to this hostility to foreigners that you have. But then you get into 1 Samuel, and that's then where you have Saul, and Israel does end up with a king. So that's sort of how this starts out. Now, we don't know, like I said, we don't know the nature of the relationship that he had. And it said he took to himself a concubine. Uh, we don't know exactly the context of that. And then we don't know, it says before his concubine, but his concubine became angry with him. The problem that you have in the Hebrew text is, and I don't know if y'all are aware of this, is that, Hebrew's text, the ancient text did not have vowels. And so that were written. So the reader would have to then supply the vowels. And so this particular word, became angry, could also be a different word that says became a harlot too. And so I read some things that was saying that he may have had this concubine and he may have been prostituting her out to other people. And that's sort of then why she became angry with him and why she left. Because we have this sort of odd story about her father really kind of protecting her by not letting the guy leave, but then not really doing what he needed to protect her. So that first part of the story, is really problematic. Did anyone have any thoughts on, so we sort of read that first part where the father kept getting the guy drunk and wouldn't let him leave?
My translation, which is the NIV, said she was unfaithful to him.
Right. And that's that word of like she was a harlot to him, and that's how that gets translated. She was unfaithful to him. But we don't know that is what happened. It says the word was that she became a harlot. And then, we had that sort of issue of to or for, like for him or to him. And so that is a choice that the NIV translation made that sort of puts the blame on her, when I don't think the Hebrew text is faithful to that sort of translation. That is and that's an interesting point that you raise, because we do see how the translators sort of, put the blame on her, so that because afterwards 4 months pass and her husband set out after her to speak tenderly to her. And the specific language that I think is speak to her heart. So I don't know what and so some of the feminist biblical scholars have looked at this, have suggested that, well, he was prostituting her or he had treated her poorly. And that's why he sort of then decided to go and speak tenderly to her to try and get her back. And we sort of, from this start, and that was the article that I had sent out, sort of looks at this through the lens of someone, who sort of suffered domestic abuse, domestic violence. We sort of see that pattern of someone trying to escape, and then the person sort of has a change of heart, goes, says, no, I won't do it again, come back. And so I think we can see maybe elements of that in the story. I appreciate you raising that, Nancy. That is interesting. And so we see that, every translation is a choice. And so we always have to sort of keep that in mind. And we see just on this thing that dramatically shifts the blame in this story as to our view of her and him.
And in verse 3, her husband went to her to persuade her to return, which is more in line with what your translation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's the evidence that they prove. Is like, well, if she's unfaithful, he would just go snatch her back, kind of thing. Right. Like it's not. And so that was, yeah. So it's interesting. And that's one of the things I think that's useful in what we sort of tried to do overall, is to say, well, let's hypothesize she was unfaithful versus he treated her poorly. And then as we go through and look at the other evidence in the story, we go back and say, okay, well, what is more in line with he treated her poorly versus she was unfaithful? And I think you're saying already in verse 3, if he's going to persuade her, speak tenderly to her, it's speak to her heart, that's more in line with what it wasn't her fault. It was something that he had done. And then when we get into this whole thing with her father trying to keep her there, again, we have that situation of, well, her father must have been trying to protect her within sort of what the rights were, because women were essentially property, at this particular time. So you were your father's property until you became your husband's property.
But she wasn't his husband. I mean, his wife. She was a concubine. She had lesser status. She really didn't have any rights. Is that correct?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I researched this, the word that some, I think it was Pilagesh is the word that is the Hebrew word. It gets translated as concubine, but I think that probably has the way we think of that word now is just almost like not a prostitute, but someone you just keep for sex, I guess. Just a wife that's just there for sex. Probably a more accurate idea or to explain it in a more accurate way would be to say, well, it was very important for people a lot of times to marry within their tribe. And so you might meet someone and take a wife who would not be of your tribe. And so, it would be sort of almost like a secondary wife, a placeholder. So that wife would be a wife, but then that would be sort of almost like an inferior position, as a wife. So that, because at this time you would have had, the practice of polygamy, would have been very commonplace. And so that's a whole nother question here as we were looking at these stories and thinking about, well, what is this, how does this help us think about sexual ethics? The concept of a man having a secondary wife, which is perfectly fine in the Bible here, is something that just is, we don't think about that as something that, is even remotely acceptable these days. So we have to, I think we're always sort of pushed to say, well, the sexual ethics at play and the ethics regarding how women are treated, we've moved so far beyond what is in these stories that we have to really think, okay, how are we able then to say, oh, well, somehow this particular story is yet again about homosexuality because the men of the town were all gay and they wanted to rape the Levite.
I don't understand what the storyteller is trying to convey from the fact that the Levite cut her up into pieces and sent her all across Israel. I don't get the message.
So this, now, not with the person, but this was a way to call the tribes to battle. So this was sort of a way, and Saul does this in 1 Samuel 11:7. So if I look at 1 Samuel 11:7, I'll just find that and read that for you. That's some context. So the Spirit of God came upon Saul in power when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly justified. So this is when the Ammonites had done something horrific. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by messengers, saying, whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. So, and what happens after this is, when these pieces go out, then the other tribes get together and they have a meeting. They sort of, and the Levite discusses what happened. And I mean, it's just kind of interesting because here's the Levite's story. So the tribes have gathered after this, sort of like the cry and says, hey, come bring all your armies. Israelites, this is 20 verse 3. The Israelites said, tell us, how did this criminal act come about. The Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered. Okay, so we have very different language now. The husband, the father-in-law, as we heard earlier. So the husband of the woman who was murdered answered, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. The lords of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house at night. They intended to kill me, and they raped my concubine until she died. So, a little different telling when he's there in front of the things of how he tells the story. One of the horrific things that really makes this particular story such a text of terror is that the Hebrew word, when he comes out and the woman is standing there, is lying there, sort of just barely, and that was sort of a big, she was very sort of like, for her to have reached out and grabbed the threshold, like to a reader at that time, that would have made her sort of looked upon as more of almost like a heroic figure, like she was sort of trying to get back to the house and had sort of grabbed the threshold, like that had some significance at that point. He goes up and says, get up, we're going. And then she doesn't move, but it doesn't say that she was dead. So we don't know that she was dead when she was there. And so that, again, certainly the author of the story has given us a lot of details and the fact that none of the characters are named kind of dehumanizes all of them. My professor that I took for a womanist professor at Columbia, who I had for an African-American interpretation of Luke class, has written an article on this, and she names the woman in the story and calls her in mishpat, which in Hebrew means there is no justice. There was no justice. And I think that's a great name for her as we think about the woman in the story, is to think of her name as in mishpat, because there was no justice for her and what happened. Does anyone have any other comments on the scene with the father? I mean, it's kind of almost comical to me as you read it, where the Levite's ready to go, and the father says, well, just have a little bit to just stay a day and just have a little bit to drink, and then tries to keep him there. Anyone have any comments on that?
It says that all the tribes of Israel collected an army and destroyed the town of Gibeah.
Yeah.
And it says that clearly the story of the Levite's concubine is indifferent to homosexuality or his heterosexuality, as is the story of Sodom. A man or a woman would serve as equally valid sex objects, and rape in either case was equally heinous. Sexual orientation is not the point. In fact, neither is the sex. In both stories, the sexual assault only serves to highlight the wickedness of the townspeople. The people of Gibeah and of Sodom are condemned for their meanness, cruelty, and abuse. Not homosexuality, but hardness is the offense of Gibeah and of Sodom.
What are you reading from, Christopher?
The what the Bible really says.
Okay, from that Daniel Hamaniak's book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good resource. I'll put it in the chat in case anyone is interested.
Yeah, it's what this book right here.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Another little bit that I wanted to point out is there's this whole dialogue about, well, why don't we go and spend the night between the man and his servant, who's saying, well, why don't we go and stay near Jerusalem? And then the man says, no, we're going to continue on. We're going to stay with people of the Benjamite tribe. And so it's sort of the man's hubris gets him in this situation where the man's insistent that they go on. So one of the things that we can look at of the, the ways that the Levite acts terribly, he treats his wife, his secondary wife, really horribly. He also treats his servant really horribly. So we have sort of, we have gender, we have class situation at play here with the guy and sort of ignoring his servant and just kind of saying, well, no, this is what we're going to do. As we get then into the town, the commentators say that the people who heard the story at the time, for a traveler to go into a town and not be offered a meal, a place to stay for the night, like that would have been shocking to people who would have heard the story at the time. They would already think, oh, these people in Gibeah are terrible because no one extended hospitality. Now, that wasn't all. Then they come in, and it was also then this violence against people who are different, and violence against the foreigners happened after that. So we have lots of different layers to this story and lots of different elements of where things have really gone wrong. And then obviously we get to the horrific thing. And what, another point, it's not clear whether it is the old man or the Levite who throws the concubine out the door. It is odd that the man says, you can take my virgin daughter, and then offers up the Levite's secondary wife. So that's something that's, kind of weird. That shows how these women were just, kind of treated as second-class citizens, or not really even almost as people, as just sort of, goods. And so, and then it's not clear whether it was the man or the older man who kind of threw the concubine out. That's not clear in the Hebrew. There's a lot of, like, in some languages like Hebrew, Greek, that the testaments are written in, because the verbs are conjugated, and you don't have to have pronouns. Like the pronoun will be contained within the verb. And so I don't know, I felt as I was reading it, there was a lot of he, and I'm like, okay, let me draw arrows. Who is this pointing to? Who's doing what? Who's doing that? So, I think we do have, even as we're reading this and trying to interpret it, like my Bible says the man through his concubine seized his concubine, but that's not what the actual Hebrew says. That is a translation decision that the NRSV translators made, whereas the Hebrew text is uncertain as to who actually pushed the concubine out.
Well, if it's called Gibeah's crime, wouldn't you think it was the older man that did it, since he is the resident in Gibeah? Even though the crime was the rape, it just seems to go along. I see what you're saying.
No, but obviously the titles that we have are just, again, translators decided to add that. That's not in the original text. We don't have we don't have verses in the original text. In the Greek in the New Testament, you didn't have any sort of punctuation, so everything really just ran together. And so one thing you'll notice if you're reading the New Testament, the word "and," every single sentence is like a run-on sentence, and that's just because there was no punctuation. And so that was really the only way that you could have a break and say, hey, here's a new thought, here's a new sentence, was to have the Greek word is kai. So if you read like in the Greek in the New Testament, you just see everything's like kai. So why do you think when we have never heard of this story? I mean, I don't think I can imagine someone preaching on this book on this chapter of the Bible. And so then, what do we do with, with a chapter like this, with a story like this in the Bible? What does this say about the Bible? What does this say about God? What does this say about justice? What is our takeaway from this story?
I think it takes away from the story of Sodom because they use Sodom to, clobber, and they can't really use this one because they don't continue to want just the men. The women, okay, she'll do, and then they did what they did. And so it was about the evilness and the mistreatment. It wasn't about the sexuality at that point. So they didn't pick this one to clobber somebody, because it would have deflated the other one.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, I
So
think
let's just don't talk about that one, because then it takes the validity of this other story we're trying to use.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the thing, is if someone comes at you with Sodom and say, okay, well, let's talk about Sodom. Let's talk about Gibeah. I'm sure you're familiar with that story as well, right? One's in Genesis 19, one's in Judges 19, basically parallel stories. And so I think this is certainly a story where you can raise a conversation about, Sodom. And to me, it also raises conversations just about, what do we do with these stories? I mean, this is not a place I find no helpful tools for sexual ethics here. There's nothing in this where I say, oh, here's some wisdom, because there's not a single person in this story who's a hero other than Mishpat, as I'll call her. She's the hero of the story, is this woman, in my view. And she's a tragic figure, but she's the sort of the hero in this story.
But I don't think it was told that way, right? I don't think the ancient peoples who heard this story thought of her as the hero, right? That's.
Oh, they look at it. Oh, you lost a possession. You have to go get yourself another one.
My experience with more of the Sodom story is that just, a couple of verses are picked out of that story and used about the men were wicked. And as you were reading it, I was thinking the one that we just read in Judge, that it sounded pretty convincing that that's what they were talking about at first, until you went on into the story. So I guess my point is that I believe these verses and these stories in the Bible have mostly been used by just simply taking out a verse or two and using that to make the point. The men were wanting to rape men. That's one of the lines, and then the judgment for doing that. Those are the 2 points that I've heard when that story is used. I was very fortunate. I didn't hear this in the church I grew up in. So this wasn't indoctrinated at an early age of the sin of homosexuality. But certainly the whole story wasn't told. And in this story, I mean, if you get by all of it and to the very end, I mean, just the concept of cutting up a body, a person, maybe that's okay if it's an animal back then. But even that would be horrific today. And I mean, how do you make a moral point if you have to tell that part of the story. So sort of rambling, but it just doesn't, the whole story, I've never heard the whole story before.
Yeah, if really the sin of Sodom is homosexuality, then this story should be, you should be able to use this story along the same lines, really. You know, like this story should be just as powerful because Gibeah does get destroyed and the people come in, you know, are so outraged at sort of what happened. But again, they weren't outraged because the men were gay. They're outraged at, you know, sort of how they, you know, treated this woman, treated the guy, wanting to try to, because they, you know, he said they were going to kill me. Then they grabbed her and killed her.
You know, I think that sexual fluidity may have evolved from this period because men wanted to know men in Exodus, and yet men wanted to know women here in Judges. So men just wanted to know anything.
I for me personally, this has nothing to do with sex. You know, like this is a story of violence. And so I think it's somewhat, I don't know. I have a real hard time even thinking about this as saying, well, we want to have sex with them. It's like, no, we want to commit the most atrocious act of violence that you can commit against another male at that particular point. Would have been, you know, like
about control.
Yeah, and subjugation.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I personally, I think you know, to suggest that the men, you know, I mean, this was just violence. To me, this is a story of violence, and that should be sort of the first step as we start to look at the Sodom story and start to say it has nothing to do with LGBTQ people. It's because it is a story of violence. It is not a story of sex. And I think we've conflated the two, you know, a lot of times, and we don't really think about, you know, we don't understand sometimes, you know, that rape is not about sex, it's about violence. And so we sort of sometimes will excuse it, you know, the way like if, well, a man couldn't rape his wife, or, you know, date rape culture we just allowed to slide for so long. I think because we sort of thought of it as a sexual crime versus as sort of a crime of violence.
I fully agree. I wasn't
Yeah.
trying to say, I wasn't trying to make the story about sex. I was trying to make the antithesis statement that if Sodom and Gomorrah Sodom was about homosexuality, and this would have been about heterosexuality, which would have broken their whole argument.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to say.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, because again, you'd have to say, okay, well, here's another whole town that was just like, if this is about homosexuality, it's like, okay, Sodom was basically everybody there was gay. Here's another town where everybody was gay. It's like, okay, this is some very bizarre situations going on in these early years where they had all these exclusively gay towns, yet somehow, you know, villages. All right. Any final thoughts on this passage? I know it's a difficult, you know, and this is seriously, people call this like one of the worst, you know, kind of books in the whole Bible. And unfortunately, I think it's our job to wrestle with these sorts of passages, because I think that, you know, it sort of tells us, is look, this sort of shows like the Bible is not something you can just pick up and say, I'm going to read this story and apply its principles to my daily life. You know, this story, you just cannot do that on any level. Everybody in here, you know, is horrible in this whole story. I mean, because eventually what happens is, you know, this sort of starts a civil war inside Israel. And so this, you know, this is a horrible story that just says, you know, this is a story about people doing horrible things to each other. You know, and the Bible doesn't necessarily say it's horrible, but so that's where we're sort of reading into it. And we're reading into it even now with different views about men and women versus what readers at the time would have read into it. Did anyone have any final thoughts, questions?
I like the pamphlet you sent out at, about her view of domestic violence.
Yeah.
That was really good. I read that already. That was really good.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, Catherine, Natasha, if you want to, I don't know if I have your email. I can send you the article that I had sent. If you want to just put it in the chat, you know, you can put it for everyone or just to me, and I'll send you this article. There's a lot of, and I'm getting another article. Our library at Columbia didn't have it, but they're going to order it for me. So like I did with the Sodom story. So this feminist writer does a reparative rereading of this story. And so I think that'll be really interesting once I get that and I can share that with you all. Okay, how do we reclaim a story that's as difficult as this? You know, what can we do? And so hopefully I'll have that and I can share that with y'all, and we can talk about that, because that's, you know, I think that's important work that we have to do, is to wrestle with these stories and you know, make something out of them. All right, so next week we will pick back up and we'll talk about the destruction of Sodom and this, again, very bizarre treatment of poor Lot's wife when she looks back and is turned into a pillar of salt. And, you know, what do we make of that story? So we'll sort of touch on that, and then we'll also look at other mentions of Sodom in the rest of the Bible next week. And there's 51 mentions of Sodom in the Bible. So we're going to go through and we're going to, we've hit on a lot of them already, but we're going to go through and just hit all the rest of the ones in the Old Testament. And then we'll look at the ones in the New Testament, and then also the places where sodomite is used in the King James Bible, because that gives us an idea about what in the 1600s they thought the story of Sodom was talking about. All right. Well, thank you all for your time and attention. I look forward to seeing you all next week.